Jenny asked me to do this. I was quite happy to do so. But it's kind of challenging as well, right? Because I mean, there's a couple of different ways I could go here. I could do this in maybe 30 or 40 minutes, or I could do it in like 8 hours, right? It just depends on how kind of deep we want to get into stuff. And I tell my students this every semester. This is what I love about history, is that it's a bottomless pit. You can never know everything. So I'm constantly learning more and more stuff that's going on. About something specific that happened in Chicago or happened maybe in Dallas or in Corpus Christi, for that matter as well. Uh, uh, so you can never know it all. You can always learn more. That's what I really love about it. But as I mentioned here at the top of the frame, first frame, all U.S. history is labor history. I mean, it's just woven so much into major events that take place in U.S. history. So I'm going to start way back in the 17th century, 1617. This is the establishment of the colony of Virginia. It was back in 1607, Jamestown, right, in Virginia. 10 years later, the Virginia Company started offering the first indentured servant contracts. So this was to try to entice people to come to Virginia, because Virginia by 1610 already had gotten a bad reputation as the killing fields. People are dying right and left. Partly because they built their fort, Jamestown, on a swamp. So there's stagnant water, right? There's mosquitoes, right? And nobody understands the germ concept of disease that's going to be developed or discovered in the 19th century. So nobody understands that yet. All they know is that people are dying right and left. And not just from that, but from the harsh weather as well, from sometimes Indian attacks as well, although they got along initially pretty well with the Native Americans in the area. And so it became kind of a hard sell to get more people to come to Virginia. They had to, because people were dying all so fast. Like, I get these numbers now, as I recall, 155 men and boys. It's all men and boys that left in 1607, left from England in January. By May, they got here in May. I think, I want to say 101 of them are still alive. The other 50 died just crossing the ocean. Pretty typical, right? This is before refrigeration of food or anything. And they don't understand germ concepts, right? So is your water safe or not? That's part of the reason the Europeans especially drank so much alcohol, because they knew that might risk a hangover, but you would not die. Less likely to die from alcohol than you were from water. So 50 of them died. Just about 50 of them died crossing the ocean, and then they got here in May, and then by next January, I think 48 are still alive. 44, I think, are still alive, but the rest are all dead. Right? And that kind of toll is going to happen again in 08 and 09 and 16, 10, 12, 11, 12. And so by 1617, the Virginia Company is trying to find some other way to entice people to come here to America. And that's how they offer these indentured servant contracts. This is the first form of labor offered, at least in Virginia anyway. And I should say this as well, that by the time 1617 rolls around, slave labor, African slave labor before that, indigenous people's slave labor had already been in use, not so much by the English, much more so by the Spanish, somewhat by the French as well, more so by especially the Spanish in particular. The English made a business decision in 1617 to bring in indentured servants instead of slaves, because slaves actually quite a bit more expensive than indentured servants, a lot more expensive. The benefit of slave, from the point of view of the slave owner, right, is that you get their labor for their entire life. But if everybody's dying within like 3.5 years, then indentured servants the way to go. So they did that, brought those in Virginia and in early Maryland as well. Most of the indentured servants were from Europe, although some of them were from Africa as well. So some of the first Africans became African Americans, had the status of indentured servants here as well. Gradually, by the 1660s and 1670s, their status is going to decline to that of lifetime slaves. So it really catches on. Slavery starts to catch on really by the 1660s, partially because health improves, right? People start living beyond the terms of their contract. So let's jump back. The indentured servant contract is a 7-year contract. You get your passage across the ocean paid for you. In return, you work for somebody else for free. You don't get paid at all. You get room and board, but no pay. But the carrot that's dangling out in front of them is that at the end of the 7 years, you have a chance now to get what they call freedom dues. Freedom dues was a small parcel of land, 50, 60 acres of land. And that's what enticed people to come here, because over in England, all the land is gobbled up by the wealthiest families. So there's no land available over there. So people are like, oh, if I'm hard down on my luck, how do I improve myself? Land is the way to go. No land here. Land over in America, in the Americas. Now, there's like 15 million Native Americans living here, right? But the Europeans discounted them because the Native Americans never developed a system of land ownership. Native Americans thought that land was something you could utilize, live on, but you don't really own it. So that means you don't pass it down from one generation to the next then either. So there's no generational accumulation of wealth then either, amongst the Native Americans. And so from the European standpoint, now they thought, oh, well, all of America is open for the taking, right? So they started coming here now in larger numbers, indentured servants, as I said, 16 teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And by the 1660s, health started to improve, and they started switching over to slave labor then as well. And as I mentioned here, I mentioned now South Carolina. That's the worst example, but there are others as well. I pick on South Carolina because already by 1700, there's a slave majority in South Carolina. There's more slaves than there are free people, at least amongst the non-Native American population, right? And that's going to remain the case all the way until the middle of the 20th century, right? It's a slave majority, 55%. And so especially in South Carolina, but even in Virginia as well, and in Maryland as well. And I should say also that slavery is legal in all the colonies. So think legal in New Hampshire and Massachusetts and Connecticut, way up to the north up there as well. Even though the crops are using, the labor-intensive crops they're using slave labor for, growing tobacco, not so much cotton yet, but tobacco, rice, and then something called indigo, which is produces the indigo color. Very, very labor intensive. So they use slave labor for all of that. None of it's being grown in the northern states, northern colonies, but slavery is legal up there as well. It's legal in each one of the 13 colonies when they revolted against Britain in 1776. And that tells me that the reasons for slavery in America are not just economic. There's this kind of economic transition from indentured servant labor to slave labor now becomes more economical to use labor for somebody who lives their entire life because their life is going to last more than 5 or 6 years. But also there's racial attitudes behind it as well. And there's a couple of historians who looked at this in, I think, kind of a creative way. They looked at the words that were being used to describe the African population. And the English people, English men, women, Europeans more generally, but especially the English in particular, referred to the Africans as black, right? And they refer to themselves as white. As I tell my students, I use the whiteboard, right, to demonstrate that these names are not literally correct, right? Because under that definition, it's still yet today, right? I would be considered white. But if I put my hand against the whiteboard, you can see I'm not white. I'm pink, something like variation of pink instead. But they use the word white, they use the word black to describe Africans and African Americans, Africans anyway. And so somebody got the bright idea, let's go back to the 1590s to the first dictionary over in Great Britain, in England, that was written, and look up the definition of the word black, and it's all negative connotations, right? So I mean, there's clearly some racial baggage that they're bringing to the table here, even before slavery catches on here. But as I said, in South Carolina in particular, the other southern colonies, Maryland and Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia as well. Georgia is an interesting story because it bans slavery when it was first formed in the 1730s. There's a guy named Oglethorpe. There's an Oglethorpe University in Atlanta right now, yet today, named for him. He was the early, I guess you call him the founder of the colony, not really proprietor, but founder of the colony. And he wanted to set up Georgia as a place of kind of social reform. So it's a place where poor English people can go to kind of help get themselves out of debt. Didn't really work out that well, but he also banned slavery because he thought slavery was morally reprehensible. He thought it was morally reprehensible because he thought it made slave owners lazy. That's his concern, right? Less so about the slaves, right? So anyway, slavery is much more concentrated in those southern colonies than it is in the north. And that slave labor force, especially in South Carolina, but in Virginia as well, they're going to build almost all the colonial infrastructure, right? So like Charleston, the city, the port, original, to the extent that it's still original yet, or Savannah in Georgia as well. Slavery is legalized there about 1750, about 20 years into the colony. And all built by slave labor. Roads, everything else built by slave labor as well. And at the time of the American Revolution, South Carolina, state with the colony with the slave majority, was the wealthiest colony of the 13. It's kind of funny that Massachusetts gets a lot of attention because Boston is there. That's where the Boston Tea Party and massacre happened and all that kind of stuff. But really, South Carolina was the big moneymaker. It was the cash cow for the colonists and for the British then as well, the British government as well. And it's because of the slave labor. I mean, slavery is hugely lucrative. James Madison, the framer of the Constitution, slave owner in Virginia, wrote a letter to a friend of his over in Great Britain. This is in the 1780s, 4 or 5 years after the end of the Revolutionary War, and had calculated what it cost his family to feed, clothe, and house each slave. And he calculated that cost at $12 a year. And in return for that $12 cost, business expense, investment, I don't think about it that way, they received labor from that one individual slave that he valued at more than $250. That's an amazing economic turnaround. And again, it speaks to kind of the lucrative nature of slavery. When Georgia legalizes slavery in 1750, it had been kind of, the economy there had been kind of sluggish in the 1730s and 40s. They legalized slavery. Suddenly it booms, takes off again because it uses slave labor. So, I mean, it's integral to all that. You can look at the 1760s here. The North Enders and South Enders are two street gangs up in Boston. They're going to help to form the Sons of Liberty, along with Sam Adams, Paul Revere, people like that. These guys, the North Enders and South Enders, they did three things. They loaded and unloaded ships, but ships weren't coming in very often. So there's a lot of downtime in between, like weeks, maybe sometimes between a ship arriving. So they loaded and unloaded ships. They drank a lot at taverns owned by Sam Adams. So he was a brewer by trade. And then they fought quite often each other. And Sam Adams convinces them to join the Sons of Liberty now in the 1760s and to redirect their anger against the British. And they're going to be instrumental in all that. So it's a working class phenomenon. The revolution itself is here as well. I mean, there's a working class component to it. There's lots of really wealthy people, the founding fathers that we think of, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. These are all rich guys, right? John Hancock as well, wealthiest man in Massachusetts. But there are working class people, or I should say wage earning, may say use that phrase and say wage earning people who are involved in the revolution as well. And then I mentioned here as well, textile plants opening during the 18th. So actually, I'm talking about the War of 1812 here. Even before that, there was a couple of pieces of legislation that the Jefferson administration passed and the Madison administration, the Jefferson's president, Madison's president, this is 1807, 1809, 1810, passed all these laws stopping trade between the United States and Britain and France. Britain and France were at war with each other. This is the era of Napoleon Bonaparte. We're at war with each other. And Jefferson, especially, and Madison as well, wanted to keep the United States out of that, right? So let's just stop all trade with those two countries. There are by far, two leading trading partners. Jefferson hoped as well that those embargoes would punish the British economy, the French economy. It doesn't really. It punishes the United States economy instead. But so really from about 1807 all the way forward to the end of the War of 1812, which doesn't end until January, really February of 1815, that 8-year period, there's like a cocoon around the United States because 1807 until 1812, these embargo acts, these legislation of stopping trade between the U.S. and the rest of the world. And from 1812 until 1815, then the British Navy is going to stop all trade between the United States and the rest of the world. And that's important, I think, with regard to labor, because back in the 18th century, the 1700s, Americans bought most of their manufactured goods from Europe. There's almost nothing made here. There's like one factory in Rhode Island, opens like 1788, has maybe 20 or 25 employees, and that's it. Most Americans made things for themselves. Most Americans made their own clothes, made their own shoes, made their own, produced their own food, right? Grew their own crops and raised livestock, built their own homes as well, built their own tools and furniture as well. But those who, like the wealthiest part of the population, like the Jeffersons and Hancocks and Washingtons, who could afford to buy ready-made goods, clothes, shoes, whatever else, furniture as well. All that stuff was made overseas. There's no manufacturing here. And this is, again, I haven't talked about this yet either, thinking about the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution comes to Great Britain far earlier than anywhere else, like a half a century ahead of the rest of the world. So there's already factories in Great Britain by the 1760s. And they're selling cheap stuff here to America. Well, now from 1807 until 1815, all that's cut off. And the Americans who had become dependent upon that said, hey, we still want our stuff yet. And other enterprising Americans said, I can make that. I can make that here, right? And so by 1815, as you can see, there are a bunch of textile, like 151 textile plants. Textile is clothing, right? Made out of wool or made out of flax or hemp, and later on cotton, especially cotton is most versatile. So 151 textile mills are going to open by 1815 in the United States, all up in New England, in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. So there's a manufacturing component to the U.S. economy by 1815 that didn't exist in 1805. And then just thinking about more kind of an overview here as well, thinking about this now after the Civil War, and I should say this as well, during the war itself, there are draft laws passed by the Confederacy in 1862, military conscription, required military service, by the Union in 1863. And you can view those as labor laws now as well, because most of the work that are going to be engaged in now in the military is fighting, yes, but also doing lots of other kind of mundane things as well, digging trenches and carting, transporting goods from point A to point B, also many of other things. Well, now they don't have a choice, right, doing that. There are riots in reaction to both of those draft laws. Americans thought a draft was un-American because they had never had one here before. At the close of the Civil War, slavery is abolished. Always with an asterisk, right? I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't free all the slaves. It frees the slaves in areas in rebellion against the Union, right? So it doesn't apply to Maryland or Missouri or Kentucky, all slave-owning states that stayed loyal to the Union during the war. And that's very carefully worded. Lincoln was worried that if he included them in the ban, that they might flip over to the Confederacy. He didn't want that to happen. So the Emancipation Proclamation has some big holes, some exceptions to it as well. It also doesn't apply to Tennessee because the Union Army is already in control of almost all of Tennessee. So it's only in those areas in rebellion against the Union. It's really the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery everywhere. It's passed now just about this time of year. I want to say about the 5th or so, 6th of December of 1865. That bans slavery everywhere. But again, there's asterisks, right? There's been a big discussion about that now in the last, it's now 15 years now in the 21st century, because, and this is language still in the Constitution yet, it says, the 13th Amendment says that from this point forward now, slavery, human bondage shall be illegal in the United States, except in cases of conviction for crime. And as I said, a number of people, historians, there's a woman named Michelle Alexander, wrote a book about 2010 or so called, I think it's called The New Jim Crow, that argues that the prison system now, as it moves into the late 20th and early part of the 21st century, is really a recreation of kind of slavery under a different name, because prison labor is quite common now as well. It's used already in the 1860s and 1870s, right after the Civil War, begins almost immediately. And while anybody can be arrested and then put on the chain gang or whatever to work for these labor gangs, the prison population then, as now, is disproportionately people of color, right? So they're far more likely to be arrested and put onto these prison gangs. So once slavery is abolished, again with that one notable exception in 1865, then the South now needs a new source of labor, a new form of labor, right? That's where sharecropping comes in. So this is a form of rental agreement, right? So where a person could be black or white as well, would go to a landowner and say, hey, I want to sharecrop your land. And they would draw up a legal contract, right? So I'm going to work your land. That means that I'm going to live on your land as well. I got nowhere else to live. 4 million freed slaves got nowhere to live. They own the shear in their backs and nothing else, right? So I'm going to go live on the land there, build a house there as well, maybe bring a family there as well, and I'll work the land for you, and we'll split the crop, right? And the contract's going to decide how they're going to split the crop, either 2/3 to one and 1/3 to the other, or half and half, or 60/40, something like that. So it's another form of labor, right? And it's another way to kind of, especially harvest the cotton crop. Like, so cotton picking is manual, done by hand, all the way until here in South Texas, really until the 1960s, to about 60 years ago. The mechanical cotton picker is patented only for the first time in 1944 during World War II, but it doesn't come into South Texas until quite late. So throughout all the 19th century, all the first 2/3 of the 20th century, sharecropping is kind of the basis of the economy in Texas, in Nueces County here, right? This is in, I think, interesting factoid, 1929. Nueces County produced more cotton than any other county in the United States. There's a reason that the Robstown sports teams, right, are called the Cotton Pickers. It was the leading, anyway, so cotton's a big deal here. And sharecropping is then as well, right? There are a lot of problems with sharecropping. It looks good on the surface, but it's a workaround now because it's ideal because there's no cash involved, right? It's a cashless form of rental, right? So you're going to pay with the share of the crop. This is ideal because nobody has any cash. The sharecroppers, the former slaves, they call them the freedmen, men and women and kids. The freedmen had no cash on them, but also the landowners didn't have any cash either. They're all cash poor because during the Civil War, those who were devoted to the Confederacy turned all their hard currency, gold and silver, over to the Confederate government in return for paper Confederate currency, which by 1865 is going to be worth bupkis, right? It's worth nothing. And so there's no cash in it. It's a cashless society in the 1860s and 1870s. And so in that sense, sharecropping is a good workaround, but there's a lot of abuse with this because the sharecroppers, especially the former slaves in particular, even some of the white sharecroppers too, they can't read and write. They're illiterate, right? So when they sign the contract, usually with an X, right, as their signature, they believe it says what the landowner tells them it says. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. And lots of sharecroppers get cheated. It creates kind of a deepening cycle of debt as well, all the way until the 1960s for the sharecroppers. People are very happy to get out of that whenever they have a chance to. So, I mean, these are just some of the overviews. You can look at some other things from the 19th century. I talked to my students about this as well. I kind of cherry-picked all these items here from different lectures I give throughout the semester. The courses I teach are History 1301, first half of U.S. history from 1500 to 1865. And then the second half of U.S. history from 1865 up until the present, as close to the present as I can get, which is sometimes not very close, unfortunately. I really need like a 38-week semester. But the state of Texas is not going to give me that to me. We're doing good if we can hold on to 16 weeks. So anyway, the cowboy strike. So the cattle drives start right here in South Texas, in the western end of Nueces County. This is before cotton becomes a thing here. Cotton becomes a thing only in 1900, 1905, when they drilled the first irrigation wells. Back in the 1860s, 70s, 80s now as well, there have been sheep herding here, and the sheep herding gets displaced by cattle herding in the area. Right? This is before there's much in the way of crops here yet. And so the first cattle drives start here in South Texas. They're driving up to San Antonio, from there up to Dallas and Fort Worth, and from there up through Oklahoma, up into Kansas, to Wichita and so forth, even to Missouri initially, later on to Kansas, later on to Colorado as well. And what I tell the students about the cowboys is that, this is such an iconic piece of Americana, right? It's like the most quintessentially American thing, right? When visitors come here to the United States, they want to bring home a souvenir with them. They want to bring home a cowboy hat. Quintessentially American, not just here in Texas, but right the rest of the country, right? Or boots if they can afford them, or a belt buckle or something like that as well. And there's a kind of stereotype of the cowboy, right? And the stereotype is that the cowboys are all white or European American, and they're not. It's very much a multi-ethnic, multi-racial force. A lot of African Americans worked as cowboys. A lot of Hispanic Americans, Tejanos here in Texas, worked as cowboys as well. But also the other part of the stereotype is that the cowboys are all happy, the singing cowboy, right? Roy Rogers did a bunch of films like that in the early part of the 20th century. This is terrible, awful work, right? And they got paid crap, right? They got paid $30 a month, so like $1 a day. And they're working basically from eyes open to eyes shut. So they're awake and they're working, right? So, you don't even want to think about what their hourly wage is going to be. And in the panhandle of Texas, this is up, I guess, a little ways north of Amarillo. So these are not working the cattle drives, but they're working on a ranch. Cowboys actually engaged in a strike up there in 1883. They wanted higher wages. They wanted $50 a month instead of $30 a month. The strike lasts for about 8 months. It is broken, which means it is unsuccessful. The landowners, ranch owners brought in replacement workers, scab workers, and the people who had gone on strike are just simply lose their jobs. So, I mean, that's another example of kind of labor kind of fitting into kind of influencing kind of these kind of larger narratives of American history. And then I talked to my students as well about railroad construction. That's another example of economic development in the West, the cattle drives, mining out in the West, the railroads now as well. And the railroads, especially I'm thinking about the first transcontinental railroad. It's completed in 1869. They drove the Golden Spike, supposedly. But the Central Pacific Railroad, building east from San Francisco, could not find European Americans to work to do that work, because they're building through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And you got like a mountain peak, lay a track. What do you mean? Where do you lay the track? You got to create a flat place to lay the track. So they would climb to the top of the mountain. Surveying crews would try to climb to the top of a mountain. They either drew lots, or maybe it already decided beforehand. One of them would be loaded into a wicker basket and dropped down the side of the mountain about 200, 300 feet or so until the ideal spot. In the wicker basket with him, he's got a stick of dynamite, a pickaxe, and a match. So he creates a crevice in the rock, wedges the dynamite into there, lights the dynamite, and then waves and says, "All right, pull me up." Right? I mean, you can understand how things could go wrong, right? So European Americans simply refused to do that work. And so the Central Pacific Railroad, I think like 90% of their workforce was Chinese. They had come here in the 1840s ready to take advantage of this California gold rush. They've been evicted from the California gold fields because they're not American, because they're not white, essentially. And so they took these jobs now. The other advantage that's provided for the Central Pacific Road is that they could pay these Chinese workers only 3/4 as much, 75% as they were paying the white workers, because that was a thing then too. And then you got like the Southern Pacific Railroad. So that's the Central Pacific, as I said, line that runs it through. It connects up in Utah in 1869. In the latter part of the 19th century, other lines, second, third, and fourth rail lines are going to be built out to the coast, including the Southern Pacific. That's the one that goes from New Orleans down through Houston, through San Antonio, through El Paso, and out to LA. And about 15,000 of those workers on the Southern Pacific are for Mexico, or Mexican American. It's hard to kind of differentiate the two, right? Because there's all kinds of travel back and forth across the border. The border is very, very porous. There's no border patrol. That doesn't come into being until about 1917, the start of World War I. And even then, it's still pretty porous. What we think of today as the border patrol doesn't really exist until the 1990s, just about 30 years ago. Before that, you could cross the border, the Rio Grande, as easily as you cross the Nueces River. And people did, right? And so there are Hispanic, Tejanos, also Hispanic population over in New Mexico and Arizona and California, building that thing as well, and working on it as well up until the 1930s, and most of them going to lose their jobs in the 1930s. So you have that example of kind of labor in these kind of larger narratives as well. And then the feminists. So I talked to my students about the women's suffrage campaign, and there's a whole big story to that as well that I won't get into it today. But the labor aspect of it is that the suffragists wanted the vote, right? Demanded the vote. Susan B. Anthony, most famously, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, some others as well, Lucretia Mott, some others. But the feminists argued they wanted far more than just the vote. The suffragists, in a way, by 1900, certainly by 1900, the suffragists have gone and moved in a much more conservative direction. One of them is saying, this is a delegate from New Orleans, said that the reason that women should have the vote is because it will help to guarantee white supremacy by doubling the white vote, right? So it's a much more conservative argument now by the start of the 20th century. And I suppose in their defense, they're appealing to Congress, which is populated by Southerners, Southern white men, right? And so they're going to listen to those sorts of arguments more. So, well, the feminists said, no, we want more than just the vote. The vote, yes, of course, but we want to go far beyond that, including equal pay for equal work. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, began pushing for this in the 19-teens already. She's not going to see it, I don't think, in her lifetime. The Equal Pay Act was passed only in 1963, right? So that's what, 50 years later. And then there are problems with it as well that still persist yet today also. You can look at, this is a bit later now to World War II, and talk about World War II in a second as well. The Freedom Ride, this is a part of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. The UAW especially, the United Auto Workers Union, they provided financial support for the organization that was staging the Freedom Ride. They're trying to forcibly integrate interstate bus travel, right? This is not Rosa Parks, that's in Montgomery, maybe back in the 1950s. This is 61, this is an interstate bus like Trailways, it's gone now, I think. Greyhound, I think, may still be around yet as well. And they had white waiting rooms and colored waiting rooms, white drinking fountains and restrooms, and then colored drinking fountains and restrooms as well. So the members of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, financed by the UAW, deliberately violated all those kind of precepts, and all the white members of CORE, the interracial body, used all the colored facilities, and all the black members of CORE used all the white facilities, right? As I said, that's made possible really by the United Auto Workers and other unions as well, the FFL more generally. And as I said, there's a lot to talk about here. So give me a high sign if you're starting to flag. This is really the central topic I want to get to. So I haven't got to the central topic yet. This is the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century before the Civil War. This is the transition away from the guild system to factory work. And I slipped earlier and used the word working class, I think back in the 18th century, the library, first part of the 19th century. That's incorrect. Because the word working class implies that this is like your station in life, right? A permanent station in life. And that's not the case. People work for wages in the 18th or 16th or 17th centuries, but they were not really working class, because typically wage earning is something you did at your age, in your teens and 20s. And by the time you got to in your 30s now, you had earned enough money. We were a nation where, colonies of farmers. So by the time you got into your 30s, you had earned enough money now you could buy a small parcel of land for yourself. So you transitioned from being an employee to being an employer once you got into your 30s. So you didn't work for wages your entire life, right? I still do manual labor. Farmers do manual labor, but for themselves rather than for somebody else. That's going to start to change now. Again, it's partly because that those textile mills are open, as I said, in the 18 noughts, 18 teens. up in the New England area. That's a good example of it. So we're going to transition away from this guild system. So the old guild system was brought here from Europe. Went something like this, very male dominated, as most things are in Europe at the time, and maybe yet today as well. I guess it's true yet today. The guild system worked like this: as a young man, you're mid-teens, 15, 16 years of age, this is before compulsory education, right? So at age 15 or 16, you would apprentice yourself out to an older man, to a craftsman, like a blacksmith or carpenter, and learn the trade from them, right? So you don't get paid. So it's kind of an evolution, maybe evolving from that older indentured servant system, right? You don't get paid during that 5 or 6, whatever your period of apprenticeship is. Your reward is your skills that you're learning, right? So by the time you finish your apprenticeship, now you know, understand a wide array of skills. And then typically you're not ready to be a master craftsman yet. You go through an intermediary stage called a journeyman, where you work for somebody else now for 5 or 6 years. Now sometimes get paid now as well, maybe a small amount. And then, so, by the time you are ready to become a kind of a master craftsman, go into business for yourself as a blacksmith, a carpenter, whatever other, brick mason, whatever else, you've got better part of a decade of experience behind you. Again, it's men, right, rather than women. So that was the old system in Europe, brought here to America. It's going to start to break down now. It's going to be replaced by factory work, right? I talked about those factories, textile plants or factories up in the New England area in the 1800s and teens. By the 1830s and 40s, factories are starting to spring up very much, mostly in the north. There are some in the south, though, as well. And those factories in the south, far fewer, but there are some in the south, are going to utilize slave labor in the factories. And that becomes a bone of contention for northern workers. As I said, I think it's all interesting, kind of helps us understand how we got to where we're at now. History does that. I grew up in the north. I grew up in Iowa, farm kid from Iowa. I'd like to be able to say that the Northerners who had abandoned slavery right by about 1830 already were morally opposed to it, and that's not the case. There is an abolition movement. People are morally opposed to slavery, but it's about 5% of the northern white population. So 95% have no moral qualms about slavery. But they start to get worried about the fact that the use of slave labor in these factories in the South, in Georgia and in Virginia, is depressing wages in the North, because they see those factories in the South as their competitors, right? And so they get concerned about that. And that's part of the reason there's growing opposition to slavery, not over moral issues or kind of apply to the slaves, but rather over the impact it's having on the working class, the emerging working class now in the northern states. And the working class now, as I said, as it's starting to kind of form now, it is going to be very routine. As I mentioned here, they're working according to a clock. And this, I think, often gets lost on a lot of our students now in the 21st, my students in the 21st century, because we're so accustomed to living according to the clock, right? We're supposed to be somewhere at 8 o'clock, right? We're supposed to be somewhere at 9 o'clock, 9:15. I had class, I would hold the class from 9:30 in the morning until 10:50. And if I decide one day to keep my students from until 11:20, that's not going to work well, because they got another class, they got commitments as well. So we're all used to living according to the clock. In the 19th century, we're not. The base clock exists already, but it's not used very much by farmers. In the 19th century, farmers typically measured time by the day rather than by the hour or by the minute, right? And so people who are coming to work in the factories now are moving from an rural existence, rural parts of the United States or rural parts of Europe maybe as well, or Latin America, into urban existence, places like Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Philadelphia and New York and so forth, from rural to urban now. And they're being shoehorned into a timed existence where, farmers in the 19th century especially, didn't get up at 5 o'clock in the morning or 6 in the morning or 8 in the morning or 10 in the morning or 4 in the morning. They got up when they wanted to. And they didn't work for 10 hours in a day or 8 hours in a day or 13 hours in a day. They worked for a while. They're task oriented instead of time oriented, right? Now they're being shoehorned into a timed existence where you have to punch the clock at 7 o'clock or whatever time you're supposed to be there, 6 o'clock. And if you're even just a minute late, that might be grounds for firing you from the job. That's a big transition for people to kind of adjust to. Work becomes very impersonal as well in the 19th century. The scale of business, of work, grows dramatically. And I use this example all the time in my classes, that back in the 1800s and teens and 20s, there were a few now shoe manufacturing operations in particular. Of all these other items that people initially made for themselves, people are quickest to abandon production of shoes for themselves. They start buying ready-made shoes. first, and later on clothes, and then later on houses and so forth as well. But they started buying ready-made shoes. And so there's already some shoe manufacturing going on in the 1820s and 30s, but on a very small scale. So an employer might have like 5 employees, right? And that means that the relationship is intimate, right? They know each other really, really well. They know each other's families quite well as well. It also means that if the work conditions are challenging because of extreme cold in Boston in January or extreme heat, then the owner experiences that alongside the workers. He's working right alongside them. Who's he, right? Well, right alongside them. And now, as we transition away from that toward factory work, now the scale starts to grow dramatically by the 1840s and 50s. So now you have not just 5 employees, now 5,000 employees, right? And the owner now is overwhelmed by this, cannot supervise 5,000 employees at one time. So the owner hires a manager. Historians call this the managerial revolution, right? A middleman, right, to deal with his employees. And then he doesn't even come to work quite often. The owner doesn't, right? He's not there. So if it's extremely cold, extremely hot, whatever else, something else, the owner's not there to kind of experience that. He's constantly pressuring the manager to increase output, increase output, increase output. And so that's what I mean when I say the work becomes far more impersonal than it had been before. And I should say this as well, that when we talk about those textile mills up in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, in the 1800s and teens, some of the first workers in those textile plants were women, young women. But the women worked in what they called Lowell mills, just outside of Boston, outside of Lowell, Massachusetts. Were kind of the anomaly. About 90% of factory workers were men. And even by 1900, I think women are their percentage of the factory workforce is going to grow from 10% up to 20% by 1900. So it's still really much a man's job. So that doesn't mean women aren't working. Women aren't working yet, right? They're doing work that's unpaid, right? We're going to start to refer to that as housework. And it gets denigrated because it's not paid, right? It gets considered as lesser because it's not paid. But the work that women are doing, mothers, wives are doing, is vital to the well-being of the family. So a mother, wife would maybe tend to a garden so as to reduce the amount of the grocery bill, basically, for the family. Would take care of some livestock. Even in cities, a city as big as New York, most people kept livestock. Pigs, quite often, maybe 1 or 2 pigs, a few chickens as well as a source of eggs, a milk cow if they could afford it, as a source of dairy products as well. And it's the woman's task then to manage all that livestock, along with their kids in as well. The kids would help out as much as they can to also kind of manage the kids for that matter as well. All that work is unpaid, right? Because the family would have to pay her, right? And it's almost like she'd be paying herself. But because there's no dollar amount attached to it, it does get seen as kind of lesser important, even though it's, as I said, vital to the well-being of the family. So work's become more impersonal. Work's become much more dangerous now as well, because we start working with much larger machines than we ever had before. In the 1800s and teens, a blacksmith might have a mallet. He's working with maybe an anvil now as well. And there's certainly a possibility for injury there, maybe even to kill somebody, right, with a mallet. The head flies off mallet accident or something like that, or intentional. But by 1850s and 1860s now, the machines are so massive now that if one person does something wrong, an entire crew of workers might be killed. And there's no safety features, right? From the point of view of the owners and the managers who are kind of getting, pressured to increase production, they see safety measures as an unnecessary expense, as a luxury, right? It's going to put them at a competitive disadvantage to their rivals. And so they don't do that. And so machines that have fast moving parts, there's no safety shield on the outside of it, right? So you have fast moving parts, people walking right next to it. If your sleeve, your shirt catches that, it might rip your arm out of your socket, right? That sort of thing happens a lot. There's no workers' compensation that's going to happen in the 20th century, going to be created in the 20th century. So very, very dangerous. And then as well, sometimes it's like mundane things like how much light is there in the factory, on the factory floor, right? Well, light costs, right? Either to build windows to create natural light or even artificial light as well, it's going to cost as well. And so they try to skimp on that as much as they could. How much distance should you have between machines with these fast moving parts? You would say, that the sane thing, I guess, would be to have, let's say, 5 feet or 6 feet. So you can walk comfortably in between there without fear of getting caught up in the gears, the moving parts. But that means you can put fewer machines into a factory floor. It means you have to build more factories. So it's a bad business model, right? So they try to squeeze these in as much as possible. So instead of 5 feet, you have maybe 1.5 feet in between them. And now people are trying to walk in between here while the machine's moving. So injuries happen a lot. And factory work is dangerous, but I haven't even gotten to mining yet. Mining, I did not tell you guys this. Some of you may know this. I studied liquor prohibition, But liquor prohibition kind of forced me to kind of study all sorts of working class issues more generally, also women's issues or masculinity and femininity as well. It's going to be wrapped up in it as well. Ethnicity as well, immigration stories as well. It's going to have forced me to kind of study all of that. And in looking at, we looked at through the newspapers. I did my research up in Oklahoma, looking through the newspapers in the 1900s and teens and 20s for stories about liquor violations or liquor policies that are being changed or proposed. And every week and a half or so, mine explosion over here, 18 killed, 20 entombed, 48 killed, 28 killed, 48 entombed, over and over and over again, especially coal mining, because wherever they're mining coal is the preferred heating fuel at the time. The ground is quite often unstable, right? So it's likely to collapse. The best way to make sure that doesn't happen is to short up with the mine shaft with beams, right? All that costs additional money. And so the manager, the owner says, let's not do that. Let's skimp on that. Or let's make the beams, instead of making them 4x4s, or let's say, I'm sorry, 2x2s, 2 feet by 2 feet in diameter, let's make them 6 inches across in diameter instead, right? And so they're spindly and they're going to collapse. Wherever you have coal as well, you also have natural gas, right? Methane. In its natural state, methane, you guys probably know this already as well. Methane is odorless. The stink that you get from it is artificially attached to it to let you know that methane is present. But it's there quite often in coal mines. And the first time you realize that there's methane present is when you bring a lantern into the coal mine, and everything goes boom, right? So this is happening all the time. Work is very, very dangerous. And work became masculinized, as I said. Factory workers really became men, much more so than women. As I said, 90% of factory workers were men. It became a part of our definition of manhood, working for wages. And that's why when someone like Harriet Stanton Blatch argues now for equal pay, there's a huge pushback against that from men, but also even from women who don't think that that's the right thing either, because it's become so closely identified with our definition of masculinity. So this is kind of the big transition, I think, that's happening in the first half of the 19th century. It's largely complete by 1860, by the Civil War, but it's going to continue even after that yet as well. Workers, the laborers, are going to respond in a couple of different ways. They engage in a series of strikes, labor actions, and then forming unions. First, early unions are very temporary, as I mentioned here. There's a national trade union that forms in the 1830s. It's localized as well. There's a few workers in one factory in Philadelphia that belong to it. And when the economy turns sour, there's a series of recessions in the 19th century. People get tossed out of their jobs, businesses close, and the union is so small, it can't do anything to help them. Right. And so people's trust in the unions then fades, right? Because when I needed them, when the chips were down, they weren't there for me. So union membership falls way off. Economy booms again. Union membership comes back in the 1840s, and there's another recession in the 1850s, and it kills union membership then in the 1850s, right before the Civil War. The first, I wouldn't say permanent, but long-term labor organization, national labor organization, is this group, the Knights of Labor, formed in 1869. And Terence Powderly started this. And Powderly takes a big tent approach, arguing that everybody should be admitted into the Knights of Labor. And the terms that they used in the 19th century were skilled and unskilled workers. Most jobs were unskilled. Like the best prime example, like ditch diggers. People worked in the railroads, unskilled workers, right? It takes maybe a couple of minutes to figure out how to do that job. That means they're easily replaceable then as well. Powderly also welcomed in skilled workers. So someone like blacksmith now, maybe, as I said, a carpenter and brick mason or stonemason as well. And they still had a great deal of skill, kind of an outgrowth of their old guild system. So they are far more secure in their jobs, right? Because if they leave, if they choose to leave, they quit or threaten to quit, it stands to reduce production quite a bit, quite a while, to train somebody up to replace them, right? Unlike unskilled. So Powderly, I think, commendably adopts this Big Ten approach. He does have an exception. He includes women now as well, because women held unskilled jobs exclusively. The skilled jobs, best paying jobs, were jealously guarded by white men, European American men. And so women as well as men of color all get welcomed into the Knights of Labor, except Chinese workers, right? They sell that as undercutting the overall wage scale in the United States. So there's an exception to that, to their generosity or their big-heartedness as well. The Knights of Labor is going to grow to several million members. It's going to peak in 1886. 1886 is a key year in labor history. 3 different things are happening at the same time. There's a railroad strike up in Temple, Texas, a little ways north of Austin. A guy named Strong, I think his name was. Anyway, was the strike organizer, and powerfully decides to put the full weight of the Knights of Labor behind the strikers against the railroad company in Texas. And it's broken anyway. They're all fired from their jobs anyway. And that defeat really damages the credibility of the Knights of Labor, and membership really starts to fall away after that, after 1886. Before that, there's also a railroad strike of 1877. This is a nationwide phenomenon. This one I think is significant, at least in part because the president of the United States, a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes, was president, sent in troops to break the strike. U.S. Army itself called in to break the strike. His rationale, his argument was that federal installations were threatened. This does sound kind of familiar, hearing some of that now in the 21st century, right?
Sure.
Right. And so that's why the U.S. Army is called in to break the strike. Just in Chicago alone, 30 people are killed, and I think 18 in Chicago, 30 people are killed in Pittsburgh in the railroad strike here in 1877. And again, it ends miserably for the workers. That's kind of the trend here in the 19th century. Most of these strikes end badly for the workers, right? They're forced to go back to work once again. And the strike is prompted by the fact that the owner-operators of these railroad companies decided kind of unilaterally to slash wages. We were in a recession at the time. They decided to cut wages by 25%. And, I mean, for working people, if you lose a quarter of your pay suddenly, that's going to hurt, right? So they went on strike and ended miserably for them. There is the Haymarket Riot of 1886. This is also that same year, 1886. This is up in Chicago, the Haymarket Square in Chicago. So a guy named Cyrus McCormick, his name is not that terribly important. He started a company to build mechanical reapers, machines that would harvest wheat and oats. And he's made a lot of money doing this now, especially during the Civil War, because of the labor shortage, because of the war, making a lot of money doing all this. Well, these workers here, and you can see the Haymarket 8, Parsons, Spies, Fisher, Engel, Ling, Schwab, Felden, and Neeb are going to help to organize a strike now in 1886. Several of them have an X next to their name. They're going to be hanged, executed in the aftermath of all this. So they go on strike on May 2nd of 1886. And the owner-operators of the McCormick Reaper factory call the Chicago Police Department, send in the cops. We have unrest here in Chicago. The cops come in and start busting heads, kill 2 workers in the process. 2 days later, on May 4th, those same workers are going to have a memorial service for those 2 slain workers, and the Chicago PD shows up again, right? And you could say they showed up to maintain law and order. I can understand that, but it's just a bad idea. So tensions are rising now. In the midst of all this, there's lots of threats back and forth. Suddenly a bomb or a series of bombs are detonated and several people are killed. And these labor organizers are going to be blamed for the bombing, the Haymarket so-called riot in 1886. There are other examples as well, but this is one of the great miscarriages of justice in U.S. history. There's no evidence linking them to this crime. They helped to organize a strike, right? There's nobody else knows yet today who detonated the bombs. That's never been determined. It could have been Chicago PD or some other fellow traveler supporting the management. But anyway, we don't really know. It could be workers as well. We just don't know. These guys, several of them were not even in Chicago the day that all this happened. They organized the strike, were gone at the time. Convicted anyway. 4 of them are going to be hanged. Parsons, Fisher, Engel, and Neeb are going to be hanged in 1887. I think Spies, so it's Louis Ling. Louis Ling commits suicide before they executed. The other 3 are going to be pardoned by the Illinois governor, John Altgeld. He was not that terribly important. Pardons them in 1893, recognizing that there's no evidence linking these guys to the crime. And as a consequence of that pardon now, John Altgeld himself is going to be summarily defeated in his bid for re-election as governor of Illinois. Because kind of an ironic, history is full of ironies, that even though it's pretty clear looking at it from the 21st century that Chicago PD initiated the violence, right? And yet the workers are blamed for all this, right? Even afterwards. So in the aftermath of the Haymarket riot, union membership, support for union membership drops dramatically. Open opposition to it grows, especially amongst the middle class. Business owners and landowners really start to hate organized labor here in America because of all that. That's the Haymarket Riot here of 1886. 1886 is also the year that the American Federation of Labor formed, the AFL. This is formed by a guy named Samuel Gompers. He's a skilled worker. His skill was rolling cigars. I think he's from Florida, as I recall. And the AFL decides to take a different approach from the Knights of Labor. They decide now to allow in only skilled workers, right? And the rationale was these are the people who are most difficult to replace, and so they're most secure in their jobs. This will make the strongest union, and you can make a good argument for that. It also means that 90% of the workforce is not represented by the AFL, the unskilled workers. Now, the AFL over the course of the 1880s and 90s and 1900s, teens, 20s is going to continually push for higher wages for their members and for better working conditions for their members and shorter working hours for their members, arguing that if they achieve any of those, that those benefits would trickle down into the rest of the workforce as well, which is kind of debatable. So as I said, 1886, a lot of things going on there. 6 years later, there's a major strike up in the Pittsburgh area, the Homestead Steel Mills, owned by Andrew Carnegie, founder of Carnegie Steel. And this, I think, is significant because up until this point, Carnegie, of all these so-called captains of industry or robber barons, I tell the students that you can get a tell right away. If you're reading a book about these guys, Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, all these other guys, Jay Gould, if they call them captains of industry, that means they see them as doing more good than bad. If they call them robber barons, they see them as doing more harm than good. Right? That's a tell you can pick up on right away. I try to use both terms when talking about this to the students. So Carnegie, all these robber barons or captains of industry, Carnegie probably had the best reputation. Jay Gould had the worst. Nobody defended Jay Gould. The guy's an asshole. Even businessmen hated him as well. He screwed everybody he could, right? So nobody likes him. He has almost no redeeming qualities. Carnegie does. He actually had been a member of the working class. Came here from Scotland, rose up to the working class. So he's really, of these group that I just mentioned to you, only self-made man, right? He's become wealthy in his own lifetime, not born into wealth like J.P. Morgan or somebody like that. But in 1892, he tells the manager of the Homestead Steel Mill, he said, hey, I'm going to leave the country. I'm going to go to Scotland to research my family lineage. And while I'm gone, I want you to take care of the union. So the manager, a guy named Henry Clay Frick, thought that meant that he wants me to break the union. So he locks him out of the factory, out of the steel mills. The workers try to get in. Clay's going to hire private security forces, detective force, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, basically thugs to beat up the workers. And a couple of dozen people are killed in Pittsburgh then as well. Carnegie comes back and expresses shock. There's still kind of controversial about this yet. I think that some historians believe Carnegie that Frick simply misunderstood him. Others don't. And think that he intended for this to happen because he's going to benefit in the end. When the union gets broken, labor costs go down. He pays his workers less when the union is gone. That's in 1892. The big one, I think, maybe is this one here in 1894, the Pullman strike. This is up just outside of Chicago, in the town of Pullman, Illinois, suburb of Chicago, just to the south of it. Pullman is named for George Pullman. He's the guy, the individual who started his own company and took out a patent on was the first one to take out a patent on a railroad car that had a bed in it, a sleeping car. No one ever thought to do that before, right? So you're going to make a lot of money doing this, making these things up. And Pullman, Illinois really is the quintessential company town. George Pullman owns everything, right? So he owns the employment, right? The factory there as well. But also he owns all the apartments that his workers rent. So when they pay rent back to George Pullman again, the Pullman Car Company again as well. He owns the grocery store as well. And they buy groceries. They're paying the Pullman Car Company for that. He doesn't own the churches, but he gives enough money to local churches that no one's willing to speak out against it, right? So in 1894, again, this is going to start to sound like an echo. Pullman decides he's going to slash wages by 25%. Now we are in a recession, started a year earlier in 1893. Announces he's going to slash wages by 25%. And workers formed a committee to go to Pullman and say, look, we understand you feel the need to do this because of the downturn in the economy. Will you at least reduce our rents by 25% so we are not evicted from our homes? And his response to that offer was to fire all the members of the committee that came to meet with him. And that sparks the strike, the Pullman strike now in 1894. This man here, Eugene Debs, is an organizer with the American Railway Workers Union, comes from Indiana up into Chicago to help organize the strike. And I mentioned him because, as I said, the Pullman strike is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is a deliberately peaceful strike because the workers knew that if there's even a hint of violence, either against people or against property, that's an excuse for them to send in the police or the state troopers or the U.S. Army or the state militia or whatever. And so let's not do any of that. Let's not have even a hint of that. Pullman contacts the president, another great 19th century name, Grover Cleveland, and tells him to send in troops to break the strike, arguing that this strike will hinder the flow of mail, because mail was shipped by the rails. The workers, in response to that threat, said, we are willing to still load the mail cars, but maintain the strike in all other aspects. And Cleveland ignored that offer by the workers and sent in troops anyway. And a number of people are going to be killed here now also. So this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, what it does is it sets a very clear precedent going forward now, that whenever there's a labor strike, that even when there's no violence, not even a hint of violence, if the government's going to get involved, the state level, the national level are going to get involved on the side of management. It's going to embolden management now for the next 30, 40 years, really, to deal harshly now with unions in the 1990s, teens, 20s, into the 30s until the Great Depression. And it's going to discourage, as you might guess, right, discourage the workers. And it's going to dismay them. But also, party politics plays a role in all this, because that other guy, Rutherford B. Hayes, the other 19th century name, back in 1877, he was a Republican. And the Republican Party, it was the party that ended slavery, but it had a bad reputation with organized labor. It did not like unions. The Republicans didn't. Still don't yet today, right? So that's kind of very consistently over the previous, now what, 160 years. So the Republicans are already the enemy of organized labor, and so organized labor has started to gravitate toward the Democratic Party. Grover Cleveland, the guy who's president during the Pullman strike, is a Democrat. And the fact that he calls in troops now as well forces the workers to throw up their hands and say, there's no hope for us with these two parties. And Debs in particular now is going to help to organize an American Socialist Party in the 1890s. He's going to run for president four different times. Never does win. I think his peak vote tallies in 1912. He gains about 950,000 votes.
From jail.
Yeah. So it never does win. But the leadership of the Republican and Democratic parties are looking at all this and saying, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap. We have this kind of two-party system, this two-party tradition, though it's not written down anywhere. It's a two-party system. We borrowed it from Great Britain. And if the Socialist Party is on the rise, and it is in the 1900s and teens, we couldn't see at the time that it's going to peak actually in 1912 and fall off after that. But at the time it's on the rise, it looked as if it's going to supplant either the Republican or Democratic parties. That very thing was happening over in Great Britain at the same time. The old Liberal Party pushed aside by a new Labour Party, which is still there yet now today. Two major parties in Great Britain are the Conservative Tory Party and the Labour Party, and Liberals are kind of on the sideline. Have been now for about 120 years, since 1905. And so they're worried about the same thing happening here in America now also. And so that's going to prompt Republican leaders, Republican and Democratic leaders now to start to initiate a series of reforms. People are so pissed. You know, the vast majority of the American public believes, I think with some justification, that the system is designed to screw them. So they're like, upset the entire apple cart, right? And that's going to force Republican and Democratic leaders to initiate some reforms now. This is kind of a very cynical view of this, of the progressive reform period, the early part of the 20th century, initiate reforms, basically to kind of knock the legs out of this rising tide of socialism here in America, to help satiate, calm some of that anger in America in the 1900s, 19-teens. Debs is central to all that. And then there's one other labor group that I want to mention to you as well, the IWW. These are the industrial workers of the world, sometimes called the Wobblies. They're around yet now today, although the current iteration of the Wobblies, I think, only goes back to about the 1990s. I think they're recreated again then. The Wobblies, as they're originally created, maybe today as well, far more radical. You know, the AFL represents only skilled workers, the IWW. And by this point now, by 1905, the Knights of Labor is kind of a forgotten thing. Its membership is way, way down. And the IWW picks all that up. All the skilled workers now gravitate toward the IWW. So lumber workers in East Texas affiliate with the IWW. And they're willing to engage in violence, especially violence against property, not against people necessarily, but against property in particular. They have a very strong stance against, they want higher wages, and that kind of makes them very similar to the American Federation of Labor. Safer working conditions, again, that's also similar to the American Federation of Labor, although they want it for all workers, but they also are staunchly anti-militaristic. The IWW takes a position that wars happen because are designed to enrich already wealthy men at the expense of workers' lives. And so when the United States joins World War I in 1917, IWW denounces it, and it now becomes targeted by the United States government in 1917 or 1918. By 1919, it's really just a shell of its former self. Almost all of its leadership is in prison. Progressives, sorry, as I said, cut me off whenever you want to, because I can go for a while yet.
How's everyone doing? Temp check? It's Klein time. What am I supposed to do? We moved from being task oriented to time oriented, and it's still Klein time.
Right.
So
So the progressives do some of the good things for labor as well. I always tell my students that the progressives are by and large members of the middle class. And I give them a whole big spiel about that as well, which I won't maybe go into just too much, but basically members of the middle class are people who own businesses, own land as well. Not big Rockefeller and Carnegie, but kind of small mom and pop businesses. That's the middle class. The wage earners, again, right, are the working class. In an American society, looks like a pyramid, small wealthy population, much, much bigger middle class, and even larger working class at the very base of the pyramid, right? So the progressives do some good things for the working class as well, but for laborers, especially through the jungle. This is written by Upton Sinclair, 1906. I don't know if you guys still read The Jungle yet. I did when I was in high school. It's pretty gross, right? It's like 500, it's a downer as well, right? It's about an immigrant family. It comes from, I forget, either Latvia or Lithuania. It's a novel, right? But it's based on Upton Sinclair working in the Chicago slaughterhouses for about 6 months before he wrote the book, right? So it's based on all that. And this immigrant family from, it's just Latvia or Lithuania. The outset, the main character, Jurgis, is a powerful man. Like he's as tall as me, but far bigger, larger, right? He can outwork anybody. But he's jovial about it, right? And everyone tells him, just wait, this place will break you. He said, oh, no, it never happened, never happened, never happened. I can outwork all you. By the end of the book, 530, 580 pages later, it has broken him, right? Because it just robs you of your health, right? They did things like they brought animals in to be slaughtered, cattle, let's say, to be slaughtered. The first thing they do is bring them onto the killing floor and take a knife, machete or whatever, and slit their necks to kill the animal, right? And so now you got blood, quite often feces, urine now everywhere, right, on the killing floor. And then they take the carcass, hang it up by the hind legs so as to bleed it out so it doesn't spoil the meat. And the next order of business is to skin the carcass, right? But they found that the hide, the hair, was getting in the way. And so let's just dissolve that with acid, right? So we're just going to take that and smear it on. All right, no gloves, no nothing, no respirator, no nothing. This is how it's going to heal their health, right? Right. And then after they've done all that, right? So now you're ready. You got the animals, the carcass, skin. You're going to quarter it into smaller pieces now as well. You're using big meat cleavers for this, bone saws as well, and it's kind of a very mundane, repetitive task, right? Just for like 8 hours a day, 10 hours, 12 hours a day. There's no 8 hour day yet, so maybe 10, 12 hours a day. Week after week, month after month, year after year, and you start to kind of zone out, right? You don't have to think about this. I'm just doing this over and over and over again. And one day you look back on your hand and one of your fingers is shorter than the others. All right, I must have cut that off. I guess I don't even know. Don't remember that happened, right? So Sinclair is a socialist. He's one of the few progressives who actually is an avowed socialist, and said that his goal was to kind of portray the plight of the workers. But people who read these articles, and then book, when it came out in book form, were all members of the middle class instead, right? And the middle class said, yeah, plight of the workers, all right. They're putting what in the sausage? Because at the end of the day, the cut finger, right? The manure, the urine, the blood, all gets kind of pushed, broomed into a corner, and then they get pushed into the hopper and they grind it into the next day's sausage and sold into the middle class. So Sinclair said very famously that when I wrote The Jungle, I aimed for America's heart, but I missed and hit its stomach instead. And so the readers became concerned about unsanitary conditions in the meat industry, much more so than the plight of the workers. So the same year it comes out in book form, the Pure Food and Drug Act is passed, creating the FDA. The Meat Inspection Act is passed, creating some standards now for the meat industry specifically, but not much in the way of providing help for the workers. There is some help coming from factory inspection codes. Most of these are going to be adopted at the state level. They recognize that we need some standards, and the only way to do this without putting any single business, any owner, in a competitive disadvantage is to pass a law saying everybody has to do this. You have to have so much space in between the machines. You have to have shields, safety shields on the machines. You have to have a certain amount of light on the factory floor, something like that. Whatever the issue might happen to be, they start adopting those now in the 1900s and teens. So that is going to help to benefit workers here in the 1900s and as I said, teens. And there's also workers' compensation insurance offered first up in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is really a leader in this period, in the progressive period. But by 1920, almost all the other states, like 48 states have all adopted workers' compensation so that if you're injured on the job, that your employer should have to pay some of your medical bills. Before that, right, you just get kicked to the curb. And then child labor laws as well. A number of states are also going to pass child labor laws throughout the 19 teens. They had all the way back to the 19th century, they have 8, 9-year-old kids working in the coal mines. It's illegal now. We're going to start to adopt mandatory, compulsory public education. And so kids need to be in school until age 14 or age 16, no longer in the factories, no longer in the mines. But the courts, specifically the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1920s, is going to roll a lot of that back, arguing that they are unconstitutional. The labor laws are unconstitutional, allowing kids to work in the mine. And this is an issue that's come back up again in my home state of Iowa, just about 3 years ago, I guess now, maybe 2 years, less than that, 2 years, a year and a half ago. They passed a law making it possible for, I think, 14-year-olds to work in factories. Like we're going back to the 19th century again. U.S. gets involved in World War I in 1917. And during the war, the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers is still a president yet, promises no strikes. AFL wants to do its patriotic duty, no strikes, no interruption in the production of goods. And that's, I guess, commendable. You could argue it's commendable. It means that wages are going to fall, or I should say real wages are going to fall. And this is an economist term where you take into account the cost of living. So that wages actually in 1918 or 1919 are higher than were in 1917, but prices rose even faster. And so your real wages actually decline. You have less buying power. It drops by a third. And because of that, they did their patriotic duty. Now, once the war is done in 1919, they're going to engage in a series. You can see now 3,300 labor strikes in the country, trying to make up for lost time, for those lost wages, because the management's going to take advantage of this during the war years, involving some 4 million workers. And that becomes worrisome to a lot of Americans, thinking that this is the beginnings of a Bolshevik revolution here in America. And that, we need to look at this in context. The Bolshevik Revolution had started over in Russia in 1917. It started with labor strikes in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. And so they really thought that, and again, Lenin and Trotsky, those other guys in charge of the emerging Soviet Union, announced that their goal was not to create a communist nation. Their goal was to end all nations, to start a worldwide communist revolution. So people thought it was coming here to America. Right, there's going to be an attack against that, response to that as well. I'll get to that here in a second. Yeah, this Adamson Act passed by the Woodrow Wilson administration in 1960, even before we go to war. The 8-hour days approved now for railway workers. And you could argue that this is a progressive piece of legislation. I think it is, but it's also very much a war preparedness measure. Because even though you don't declare war until 1917, even though Woodrow Wilson, I kept you out of war in the past, I'm going to do so in the future as well. He knew privately we're going to get involved in this war. And when we get involved, he said, I want to make sure that there's no interruption in the flow of goods and troops in America. Best way to do that is to acknowledge the central goal of workers have had in the railway industry since the middle of the 19th century, and that is the 8-hour workday. Helps to guarantee no strikes. Women during the war years themselves filled men's jobs. And this is something that happens over and over again. It happened back even during the American Revolution and the Civil War, World War I, World War II, most famously the Rosie the Riveter image, but also to some extent during the Korean conflict, the Vietnam Wars as well, Vietnam conflict as well, that good paying jobs that people assumed women couldn't perform. They were shut out of. The gender barriers that kept them out of those jobs suddenly come down now in 1917. And because of the labor shortage, because of the draft is on. Initiated a draft once again as well. And so women are not just allowed to take those jobs, they're encouraged to take those jobs. And so for women, the wartime experience can be characterized as kind of a freeing, a liberating experience, right? Because they now are able to perform tasks, to demonstrate that they can perform these tasks as well as men, maybe in some cases maybe better than men. But as soon as the war is done, they're going to be pushed back out of those jobs again, right? And there's kind of a common theme here in 1919, again in 1945, and 1953 as well, at the end of the Korean conflict, that women should, for the betterment of our society, surrender these jobs to the returning veterans. And so the gender barriers come right back up again. Get pushed back out of it again. Yeah, in the 1920s, immigration from Latin America, more generally Mexico in particular, picks up. And this is part of a larger story as well. Congress is dominated by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. Klansmen are elected to Congress, to governor's chairs, maybe to the presidency. Woodrow Wilson seemed to speak favorably of the Klan. His successor, Warren Harding, had been a Klansman before he became president. Wilson's a Democrat, Harding's a Republican, so it's a bipartisan organization now as well. And those Klansmen in the Congress decided they didn't want any of these foreigners coming into the United States from Europe. right? So they put strict quotas on immigration to the United States from Germany and Hungary and Poland and Russia and everywhere else, in Europe, Greece and everywhere else. And the employers now looked scrambled trying to find another source of labor. They find it from Mexico, but as I said, also from Puerto Rico as well, the East Coast, to replace those workers that they lost. The Klan is going to target unions and socialists, especially in the 1920s. So the Klan forms way back in the 1860s. It's, you know, what the Klan has become famous for. It's a racist organization engaging in lynchings, murder, burning buildings as well, engaging in threats as well. But in the 19 teens, especially in the 1920s, the Klan in the 1920s broadens its target base to include not just African Americans, anybody who is challenging the ideas of white supremacy, also Roman Catholics and the Jewish community are going to be targeted by the Klan now as well. The new woman, as they call it, women who are going to exercise their newfound ability to vote, right? Women gained this vote in 1920, become the target of the Klan. And then also unions and socialists now are painted out as un-American. So the Klan defines 100% Americans. That's their catchphrase. 100% Americans very narrowly to be a good 100% American, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. Not just white, but Anglo-Saxon from the northern and western parts of Europe, right? So Italian and Greek, not so much. And then Protestant, right? So Catholic, to leave the Irish population out. Insufficiently American. And again, that's true here in South Texas, then for the Mexican population as well. And Mexican American, the Tejano population also. They're recruited to come into South Texas to harvest crops. Cotton, most famously, but onions as well. Maybe some melons already as well, but onions I know in particular, and cotton. Those workers, they are undocumented, right? I don't know if they really used the term illegal at the time, but they certainly are undocumented coming here to America. They're recruited to come to America from into Nueces County. Landowners in and around Corpus Christi went to Nuevo Laredo on the rail lines, what they call the Tex-Mex line over to Laredo, into Nuevo Laredo, recruited workers to come in and plant to harvest their cotton crop. And this doesn't always happen. I think it's unfair to paint all landowners with one brush, but it happens a lot more than once or twice. That in many instances, the owner operator, the landowner, would recruit the laborers to come in and would pay them after they got the entire crop harvested. Right? That was kind of standard practice. And so some of them would instead wait until 95 or 98% of the crop harvest is in, and then contact the authorities and say, we have undocumented laborers here, send them back to Mexico, and nobody gets paid anything. That happened, as I said, not just once or twice, quite a bit here in Nueces County and in other counties in South Texas as well. And something similar is going on in California then also. And as I said, on the East Coast, workers are recruited from Puerto Rico. Not really immigration, because again, Puerto Rico is a part of the United States, have been since 1898. But migration from Puerto Rico is recruited now. Migrants are recruited from Puerto Rico into New York and Philadelphia to replace those workers. Because in the past, in the 19th century, the factory owners, you know, they hired immigrant laborers from, let's say, Ireland initially in the 1840s and 1850s, potato famine and all that. And then after the Irish Americans became more established, a generation or so, they began demanding higher wages. They fired them all and replaced them with German immigrant workers, right? And then after the same thing happened, the Germans became more established by the 1860s and 1870s, they fired all them and replaced them now with Hungarian. And the Hungarians got established, demanded higher wages, they replaced them with Polish, and again, on and on, Italian and Greek, and as I said, Russian as well. All that's cut off now. And so they're going to recruit workers now from Puerto Rico instead. In thinking about the 1930s, workers very much drove the New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression. There's actually a couple of different New Deals. Historians talk about this, the first New Deal and second New Deal. One's in 1933, a rash of legislation that happens in the first 100 days of the administration. And then a second rash comes about in 1935 when Roosevelt's trying to get reelected. Easy to be cynical about Franklin Roosevelt. He's a good guy, but as I said, easy to be cynical about him as well. This National Recovery Administration, the NRA, is the centerpiece of that first New Deal in 1933, and it creates now a minimum wage for all NRA members. Right, so you have to pay you have benefits, you get low interest loans from the federal government, but you have to pay your workers a minimum wage, usually 25 cents an hour. But it's only for members of the NRA, right? The TVA is going to be created. The Tennessee Valley Authority is going to build now some 33 hydroelectric dams in and around the Tennessee River area in the states of Tennessee and Alabama and North Carolina and Kentucky over the course of the 1930s, 40s, 50s. It's really a jobs program. It's also going to produce, hydroelectric dams, produce electricity in an area that had none at all. Still had not been electrified yet. And then much more extensively in 1935 until 1943, the WPS, the Works Progress Administration, is the centerpiece really of that second New Deal when Roosevelt, again, speaking cynically, is trying to get reelected, guarantees reelection in 1936. It's a massive jobs program, 8 million jobs over the course of the next 8 years. Del Mar College here, the Memorial Classroom building at the corner of Baldwin and Ayers was built by the WPA. There are sidewalks still here in Corpus Christi. This is up on, was it Takwa Street that runs right next to the public library that still have the WPA stamp in them from the early 1940s, I would guess 1940s. And for reasons that I can kind of guess, those sidewalks are in some of the best condition of all the sidewalks in Corpus Christi. Right? Because there's no profit motive, right? So there's no need, no desire, no incentive to skimp on materials or labor because it's not for profit, right? These are government jobs instead. Up in San Antonio, the Riverwalk started really by the WPA as well. There's an amphitheater on the south end, I guess, of the Riverwalk. You can still see the WPA plaque there yet from the late 1930s. I built that. In 35 as well, the NLRB is going to form. This is the National Labor Relations Board. This is a federal agency now that's going to monitor labor elections, right? So that up until this point, there was nobody monitoring. That means that management could tinker with, mess with the elections, right? Could put a couple of stool pigeons in to sway an election toward people that are going to favor them, favor management, not the workers. Now everybody has to kind of play above board. And if they come to an agreement, enter into negotiations, the NLRB is there to make sure everybody abides by the terms that they agreed to. They can't just walk it back or lie. And that's still around to today. The NLRB is not as active today now as it was even maybe just 50 years ago into the 1970s. It's still there yet today. It doesn't get used as much. I think especially under the current administration, it doesn't get used very much at all. The Fair Labor Standards Act is going to be passed in 1938 toward the end of the New Deal. This is going to create a nationwide now minimum wage of 25 cents an hour. Not just for members of this NRA, the National Recovery Administration, but all businesses now. However, there's always an asterisk. Some employment is exempted from this, right? So house servants are not bound by, employers of house servants are not bound by the minimum wage, nor are employers of migrant laborers, farm laborers are going to be part of that as well, nor are waitstaff in restaurants. That's still true yet today. Later on, migrant laborers and others are going to be added on. It's going to be broadened. Nurses, I think, originally were not a part of this as well. 1938 is also the year that the CIO forms. So I made mention of the AFL. The AFL-CIO is still around today, right? So the second part of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, formed by this man here, John Lewis. He's with the United Mine Workers. These are all unskilled jobs. And because, again, the vast majority, 90% of the workers in America hold unskilled jobs, the membership of the CIO eclipses the AFL membership almost immediately. They're going to start to gradually work together, will merge in 1955 to form the AFL-CIO that we still are familiar with now today. 500,000 Mexican Americans are going to be deported from the United States in the 1930s. And I'm trying to speak very deliberately here. Some of the people who are deported are people who were born outside the United States, but some of them are people who have been born here in the United States. Maybe had been born here in Texas, for instance, since before it was a part of the United States. Going to be sent out of the country because the thinking is that those jobs need to be reserved for the white workers instead, the European American workers instead. So from the point of view of the Hispanic population, there's this kind of boomerang effect, right? Because in the 1920s, they're all encouraged to come into the United States. In the 1930s, said, no, get away, get away, get away. In the 1940s, there's going to be a labor shortage again during World War II, and there's going to be a campaign, a program now put in place now to draw them back into America yet again. 1940s. Women filled men's jobs as they did in World War I, as I said, in Civil War before that as well. This is interesting, I think, because in 1942, still the attack on Pearl Harbor happens in December 7th, 1941. So we get involved in the war really in 1942. And early on, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president, calls now for the United States to produce 50,000 planes per year. People thought he was nuts. Never happened, never happened, never happened. By 1944, we're producing 96,000 planes per year, almost twice that. And that productivity is one of the major reasons the Allies win the war. American productivity and Soviet lives. right? And I don't want to discount, the number of Americans, 500,000 Americans who die in World War II in Europe as well as in the Pacific. But there's 20 million Russians who die, right? So I mean, for every American that dies in World War II, 40 Russians die, or Soviets, I should say, die. But that productivity here in America, that really we simply outproduce our opponent, is accomplished primarily by women. They're by 1945 or 57% of the workforce. Despite all that, again, the Rosie Riveter image and campaign, they are offered no advancement. These are considered kind of short timers, right? So they're going to be fired from these jobs again, 1945 and 46 when the GIs return, viewed as temporary workers instead. As I said, the AFL-CIO emerges in 1955. They're going to help to finance the Freedom Ride in 1961. I think I mentioned that to you just briefly before. Factories leaving the inner city. So this is something that I talked to students about in the 1920s. Really, it starts in the 1920s. It's still going on yet today now, 100 years later. That in the 19th century, the central part of town was where everything happened. And everything happened right around the railway stations before cars, trucks, highways, or anything like that. And so businesses, factories would all locate right next to the railway station so that they could bring the raw materials in by rail, and then they would have horse-drawn wagons to carry those goods from the railway station out to the factory. They wanted to make sure that was short, half mile, a mile. So all these factories are clustered on top of each other in the central part of the 19th century. And there's no cars, right? So most Americans walked to and from work, right? They call it the walking city. And so an acceptable commute was about 2 miles, to walk 2 miles to and from work. So people live within a 2-mile radius of these factories. So people live on top of each other in the central part of the city, right? Well, beginning in the 1920s, the automobile becomes popularized. It's not new anymore. It's been around since the 1880s, but the number of automobile registration is going to triple in just the 1920s alone. It becomes affordable. Henry Ford starts producing those Model T Fords at a price that almost anybody, even the working class, can afford to buy them. $300, $370, I think, something like that. So many Americans start buying automobiles, and that's going to free them now to leave the inner city, where everyone's living on top of each other, where it's crowded and loud and stinky. They're moving out of those city centers now to the outskirts, or maybe to the suburbs then as well. But the population that moves is the European American or white population. Populations of color are not allowed to move out. There are racial covenants, legal documents that said, if you agree to buy a home in, I'm going to use just an example, Des Plaines, Illinois, suburb of Chicago. You're going to buy a home in Des Plaines, Illinois. You sign a document saying, I agree never to sell this home to an African American, Hispanic American, Jewish American, Native American later on as well. You kind of fill in the blank, right? Right? So those populations of color are trapped in the inner city. Well, at the same time, the automobile is freeing the white population to move out. Businesses and factories are moving out of the city center as well, because real estate is most expensive in that city center, right around the railway station. So if we want to expand the factory, especially, there's no place to do so here in the downtown area, downtown area, yes. And so let's move out to the suburbs instead, out to the outskirts of the city instead, to Des Plaines and out of Chicago proper. And so the jobs are leaving now. Not away, but kind of gradually in the 1920s. It's suspended somewhat in the 1930s and 40s because of the Depression and World War II. Picks up again and accelerates in the 50s and 60s. So by the 1960s, there's all these populations of color, people of color, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, as well, Asian Americans now are stuck in these inner city ghettos with no work, no jobs. That's what I mean when I'm talking about the factories leaving the inner cities. And that's all made possible partially because of the car, but also because of the truck. The short haul, not like a pickup truck, but like as a kid, I used to call these straight trucks, not an 18-wheeler, right? But a two-axle truck, short distance haul trucks, short haul trucks. That were used then now to ship those goods. The people still in the 1950s and 60s, their factories still brought their materials in by rail and then used a short haul truck to ship their goods from the railway station out to the factory. So you could locate now 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 miles out from the city center. Jobs all leave. As I said, the other populations are still there yet. And we're still wrestling with that yet today, right? I mean, there's parts here of Corpus Christi that you can describe that way. Hillcrest, I think, is a prime example, but also lots of there. You can look at the near west side, I think, as well. Some other areas, and you can say, I mean, every major city, every city has got the same kind of phenomenon going on. I think that in the 1960s and 1970s, we had big ambitions about trying to solve this, trying to end, maybe even end poverty. But what people who were pushing this recognized after a fashion, is that the only or surest way to end poverty is through fundamental wealth redistribution. And as a nation, we've never been very comfortable doing that. And so that conversation basically stopped by, let's say, the mid-70s, and we've just plodding along now as we have for the last 50 years. And periodically, something happens, right? So there's urban riots in the 1960s, and we're all surprised by that, right? Because of the treatment by the police, but also because there's no jobs in the area, right? And then again, the 1990s, the Rodney King riots. There's riots in Los Angeles, right? And people are surprised by that, right? It's the same kind of underlying causes. Or in the 21st century, Ferguson, Missouri, right? It's not just, again, the treatment by the police, but the fact there's no economic opportunities in inner city areas where people are living there, right? We just decided to ignore the problem. And so it's going to come back up again. It's just a matter of time. Before it gains kind of national, it's still here yet, before it gains national attention again. I talked to the students about this as well toward the end of the semester in the 1302 class, the grape growers. This is the work of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. I got them written back over here as well, but also another man, Larry Itliong, written right above them. So this is in Southern California. Itliong was a labor organizer for the Filipino workers. And this is the way things worked out there in Southern California. The landowners would hire Filipino workers to pick their crops. And if they demanded higher wages, they fired them all and brought in Mexican workers. And if they demanded higher wages, they fired them all and brought in Mexican-American workers. If they wanted more money, they fired them all and brought in African-American workers. And if they wanted more money, they fired them all and brought in European-American, white American workers. So they pitted these ethnic groups against each other. In 1965, this grape picker strike, Itliong is going to launch this now, strike against the grape growers in California. And Chavez and Huerta have just organized what's going to become the National Farmers Union, decide now, rather than constantly battling against these Filipinos, let's work with them to make common cause with them. And that's going to start to enjoy a great deal of success in improving wages, some working conditions as well, although there's always some challenges still yet in the 21st century. A year later in 66, Chavez and Huerta are going to organize, let me just say this, in social activism, women do most of the work. And at least back to 1800, the 19th century, the 20th century, and the 21st century, women do most of the work. Men quite often get the accolades, right? But women do the work. I mean, and I think that Cesar Chavez did great work. There are highways named after him. Dolores Huerta doesn't get a mention, but she's actually the one who's negotiated a lot of those contracts in the 1960s and into the 1970s. They organized UFW. They're going to stage a march from Southern California to Sacramento, calling for higher wages in the field, working conditions in the field, and here in Texas now, they're going to stage a march from Rio Grande City up to Austin. Starts in July 3rd, I guess, of 1966. They're going to walk about 15 to 20 miles a day in the South Texas heat, getting up to Austin by September, by Labor Day. They're calling for a statewide minimum wage of $1.25 because the federal minimum wage law, $1.25, did not apply to migrant laborers, to farm workers. The state legislature ignores them. The governor ignores them. They ask the governor to call a special session. The governor says no. 1967 comes along. A year later, there's a regular session of the legislature. There is a bill introduced, but it goes into committee and dies. And one political observer in Austin said that if any bill, I think the phrase he used is, if any bill ever got a cement overcoat, that one did. It's just sunk. And what that does is that it awakens the Hispanic population, the Tejano population in Texas, that we've got a government here that's not serving our interests. Very few Hispanic office holders in the 1960s. Yet that's going to start to change now in the 1970s and 80s. In the state legislature, for instance, I think there's 9 Tejano legislators in 1965. By the most recent numbers I got are from 2020. I think there's something like 46, 48 Tejanos in the state legislature. So growth, you could argue that it should be higher yet than that, but there's significant increase because of that. In this farm workers march in 1966, they came here through Corpus Christi, July 31st, thereabouts, stopping. They had a rally at People Street, T-Head, downtown. And they raised money. I think they raised almost $1,000, just a lot of money at the time, to help cover finances as they're moving on from here up to Sinton, up to Pleasanton, up to San Antonio, and eventually up to Austin by September. So I think it awakens that population that we need to get involved in politics. You start to see, I think, uptick now in voter registrations, but also in people willing to run for office. I think that's a good thing because you had a population that just wasn't being represented by the government. This is another action by the UFW. Let's boycott. So this is a new tactic that Chavez started, launched in 1970. Rather than engaging in more strikes, they decide let's engage instead, urge the American people, the consumers in America, to boycott lettuce growers from California. And people got on board with it. Organized labor did as well, so did college students as well, housewives and house husbands as well, all got on board with this as well. You can see the AFL-CIO supported this very much also. It's so effective, in fact, that Chavez gets himself thrown into prison for his organizing effort here in the first part of the 1970s. The Equal Pay Act banned discrimination in federal programs. There was actually an earlier Equal Pay Act in 1963 already that said, from this point forward, 1963, men and women are doing this in industry, private business. Same job, they have to be paid the same amount of money. It's striking that it takes until 1963, right? The better part of 200 years of our nation's history to happen. But it's because the idea of working for wages was kind of wrapped up in our definition of masculine manhood. And the Act of 64, this one now, the Equal Pay Act of 72, that bans discrimination in companies that receive federal monies or federal programs, there are big loopholes. We found this out now in the 21st century. This is in 2007, I guess. A woman over in Alabama named Lily Ledbetter had been working in a tire company for about 30 years, and found out that her employer was paying her less than her male coworkers for doing the exact same work. And she said, hey, this is a violation of the Equal Pay Act. Goes to the courts. The courts said, yeah, you're exactly right. You got to pay her the same way you're paying the male workers. And Lily said, I want 30 years of back pay that you stole from me. And the court said, no. So it sends a very strong message to the business, to employers throughout the country, right? That you have to abide by the Equal Pay Act, women the same amount of money you're paying men for doing the same work, unless you can get away with it. If you can get away with it, then good on you. So that seemed the message from the court. So we're still wrestling with that yet now today. I mean, you look at, I'm sure you've seen these numbers, I guess, before, that for every dollar that a man earns in America today now in 2025, woman earns, numbers vary 79 to 81 cents, and we're right about, let's say right on 80 cents. A pretty clear discrepancy. Work is work. I think it should be compensated equally. In 1981, the new president, Ronald Reagan, fired all the air traffic controllers. There's a certain irony in all this, in that the air traffic controllers union was the only union to endorse Ronald Reagan, president in 1980. They went on strike and he fired them all. And that really sends a strong message now to organized labor, that we have somebody who is not just not a friend, but somebody who's openly antagonistic to organized labor in the White House throughout the 1980s. And you can see, despite that, in 1984, when Reagan runs for re-election, 44% of the union rank and file voted for him. The leadership did not endorse him, endorsed Walter Mondale, the candidate from Minnesota instead, but the rank and file voted for Reagan. Last frame, sorry to keep you so long. 21st century now, there's some disturbing trends. Back in 1913, was that 112 years ago, Americans worked on average 2,600 hours per week. By 1990, it was down to 1,600. By 2024, it's back up to 1976. It's growing again. And one of the ways that employers are getting around the minimum wage law and the maximum hours, right? You have to get paid overtime, right? If you're working more than 40 hours in a week, is they put people onto a salary. I had a job like that back in the 1990s, working for a school bus company. And they said, good news, Jim, we're going to make you, what they call me, operations manager. And we're going to pay you, just at the time, it was a lot of money, $32,000, something like that, $30,000, $32,000 a year. But if you look at, broke down all the work that I had to do, I had to work 50 to 60 hours a week to be able to get all those tasks done, right? And so the hourly rate actually was below minimum wage. And this is how they're doing it now in the 21st century. I tell my students that I don't know if they pay attention to this or not. I kind of hope they don't, because it's kind of depressing. That the weekend is a creation of the 20th century. It doesn't exist in the 19th century. It was just work. You just worked 7 days a week. So they just worked the whole year. Maybe you got a week or two off for Christmas and that was it, or for the holidays, and that was it. But otherwise you just worked 7 days a week. So 1 week just bled into the next. There's no weekend, right? That's a creation of the 20th century now, with that minimum wage, maximum hours, that 40-hour work week from 1938. But in the 21st century now, because of all these maneuverings now by the employers, the weekend's kind of going away, right? People work as much on Saturday and Sunday now as they do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And I had this discussion with my students just this past semester. We were talking about what to do about increasing voter participation, voter turnout, get people to vote in elections. I said, well, here's a suggestion people have had. We should make election day a national holiday. And one student said, I think very poignantly, oh, well, we would just have to work anyway, right? Because they work on the holidays now, right? And that's not the case. 50 years ago, I remember this is even just 30 years ago. My mom had passed away already. My dad was still alive yet. Went to visit him over Thanksgiving. We're stereotypically two guys, don't know how to cook, fumbly fingers in the kitchen, right? So we're going to decide, let's see if there's a restaurant open on Thanksgiving. All kinds of them open. Like, when the hell did this happen? It wasn't like this in the 70s or 80s. Those people got to work then, right? They can't enjoy Thanksgiving themselves because they're serving food to me, right? My dad and other people then as well on Thanksgiving. Other kind of depressing news, real wages, again, that takes into account the cost of living, grew in America until 1973. That's the tipping point. So is that 52 years ago? Grew at a rate of about 2% per year, fell afterward. And now there's a big discrepancy. This is, I guess, a while back now, already 2005. Real wages, again, taking into account the cost of living, are 8% less than they were in 1973, but only for those without a college degree. There's a widening gap now between rich and poor. And people have talked about that as well, income inequality. For college, those who go to college, hire for those who are knowledge workers, they're making out much better, or significantly better than they were back in 1973. But people who do not go to college, just graduate with a high school diploma or don't even have that, are falling way behind. And I think that Donald Trump at least appeals to part of that population as part of his base. That they feel, understandably, is that the system is screwing them. And so I don't agree with them, but I understand why they might decide to vote for that guy, even though he is just one of the worst possible people to vote for, to be around. Good news in the 21st century. I'm sorry, there's one more frame. Sorry. There is an increase in unionization amongst service workers. Starbucks, most famously, and not just like in the northeastern parts of the United States, which historically have been much more union friendly. It's like Alabama, Starbucks. That's really encouraging. Amazon workers now as well, starting to unionize now also. College faculty are organizing. I've been a part of all that since about 2007, just a year or so after we got here at Del Mar College. And it was always an association. We never wanted to use the word union because we didn't think the faculty would go for it, that they want to differentiate themselves, ourselves from workers. That's no longer the case. They're rushing out. Our American Association of University Professors, AAUP, has affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers back 3 years ago. So we're part of the AFL-CIO now. That's a good thing. It's also, I mean, a sign of the times that our membership has, I think, statewide membership has tripled in the last 2 years, which is great, right? Union growth numbers, but it's tripled because of Dan Patrick and Greg Abbott, right? And the state legislature. They're really messing with higher education. AI destroying jobs. I read an article about that just this past week. There's some people who are very rosy about artificial intelligence. I'm not. I don't have a. No one's going to mistake me for a techie, certainly. But I just think that any new technology needs to be looked at honestly and there's always going to be positives and negatives from anything. You got to look at the way those against each other and figure out whether there's more good or bad, or more bad than good. I think AI is going to be problematic. And that, brings me to environmental concerns about it as well, because the water usage as well and electricity usage as well. Other encouragements, we'll see how it plays out. There's a rumor now, I haven't seen this confirmed yet, that the Naval Air Station workers out of Kingsville are talking about a strike. That's good.